Hello, and welcome to this Bournbrook podcast. In this episode, a long-awaited return to our interview series by Guy Denton, of which many more episodes are yet to come, Guy talks to Robert P. George, an American legal scholar and political philosopher who currently serves as the 6th McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. Enjoy.
Would be with your intellectual and spiritual development. Were you raised religious, and did that develop and become more robust as you read? And also, how did you discover natural law, and how did you become committed to natural law theory and develop a particularly strong academic interest in it?
I was born and brought up in the heart of Appalachia, the mountain region in the eastern part of the United States. I come from the state of West Virginia, which is one of 13 states touched by the Appalachian Mountains, but the only one wholly within the Appalachian Mountains. I'm the grandson of immigrant coal miners. My father's father came from Syria, and he and his family were Syrian Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox of the Eastern tradition. My mother's father came from southern Italy, from Calabria. So that side of my family is Catholic. And I was baptized and brought up in the Catholic tradition. But with so many relatives on my father's side practicing the Eastern Orthodox faith, I grew up with an appreciation, which I'm very grateful for, of Eastern spirituality and thinking, Eastern Christian spirituality and thinking. One of the most memorable religious events of my boyhood was attending the funeral of one of my great aunts, my father's aunt, who had the good fortune to die at Easter time. And so the funeral liturgy included the sort of Easter singing in the Syrian Orthodox tradition. And it was so hauntingly beautiful that to this day, I doubt that anyone who ever actually attended such a thing, witnessed it, experienced it, could be or remain an atheist. It was so overpoweringly deep a spiritual experience that, as we lawyers say, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. But I was brought up in the wake of the Second Vatican Council in the Catholic Church, so it was a time of considerable upheaval and uncertainty. I can just barely remember the old Catholic Mass, the pre-Vatican II Latin Old Rite Catholic Mass. I was an altar boy beginning when I was 7 years old, and I learned the prayers, the altar boy's responses to the priest in the old liturgy. But then by the time I was 10, the church had shifted over to the vernacular liturgy and to the new rite, what we call the Novus Ordo. And that's what I was brought up in. And of course, there was a lot of chaos in those days. And the catechesis I received, as Catholics call it, the religious education I received, was quite poor, as I have to say was my education overall. It's not an area of the United States that is known for high quality education. The schools weren't great. I had very nice teachers, and they did the best they could, and some were really very good, but I did not receive a good education either religiously or in terms of secular subjects, as I learned, as became clear to me when I went off to university, to college. I went to a very challenging, intellectually demanding college called Swarthmore College near Philadelphia, and I found myself simply utterly unprepared for the intellectual work that a first-year student was expected to do, or at least to be able to do. So that took an adjustment, and I had to learn quickly. Unfortunately, I had the blessing of being taken under the wing of a couple of professors who just nurtured me. That's all that can be said. Nurtured me, and in both cases, they also encouraged me to a kind of independence of mind, a willingness to think for myself, that I will be eternally grateful to them for nurturing. They had already, so this was the mid 1970s when I went off to university, to college. We already were starting to experience the phenomenon that later got labeled political correctness, the kind of groupthink that we now label wokeness. That was already in embryonic or nascent form appearing. And both of the professors, I'll name their names, they deserve to be named: Linwood Urban, who taught medieval philosophy and religion, and James Kurth, who taught political science. Both of those professors just viscerally despised groupthink of any sort. And they encouraged their students, and they certainly encouraged me to reject it and to question the prevailing dogmas on campus. One of the nice things about my experience at Swarthmore, especially studying with Professor Urban, was that it introduced me to some of the classic philosophical debates, including debates about the possibility, and if so, the foundations of ethical thinking. What we Aristotelian Thomists would call the first principles of practical reason, which Thomas also tells us are the basic precepts of natural law. So I became interested in natural law and in what sometimes is called meta-ethics, sometimes called fundamental ethics, sometimes called ethical theory. Let's call it that. I became interested in ethical theory and in the natural law tradition as one of the main competing traditions in the debate about ethical theory at Swarthmore, and mainly under the tutelage of Professor Urban. So in learning about natural law theory, I also, of course, had to learn about the competing traditions: moral skepticism, utilitarianism, Benthamite philosophy, Kantian deontological theorizing about ethics, and so forth. But there was one event, one episode, could almost pin it down to a moment. It happened, if I remember correctly, in my second year, when I was taking an ordinary, perfectly good, but not special survey course in political theory from a very good teacher. But it was a survey course, so it wouldn't be anything too exciting. Except it turned out to be very exciting for me, because one of the assigned readings was Plato's dialogue Gorgias. This was the first dialogue of Plato's I had ever encountered. I'm sure when I arrived at Swarthmore College, I did not recognize the name Plato. I couldn't have told you who he was or anything about him. You've heard of people not knowing anything. Well, I didn't even suspect anything. I mean, I was looking back. I was unprepared. In any event, I read that dialogue because it was a required reading in the course, and it shook me to the core. It made me question the foundations of my own beliefs, my assumptions, including, most fundamentally, my assumptions about why I was doing the work to receive an education, what education is all about, what learning is all about. Why do we engage in dialogue, debate? Neither of my parents had been to college. I was the first to go to university in my family. Honestly, I was saved from the coal mines by World War II. My father didn't end up in the mines because he was drafted into the Army when he was 18 years old and still in high school. Taken out of high school, the school later sent his parents a diploma. Taken out of high school and sent to fight in Normandy and Brittany in France in 1944, 45. And then when he came back, there were new opportunities for him, but one of those was not the opportunity to get a university education. So I was the first in my family to do that. But I had an essentially instrumental view of education and of learning and of knowledge, really, frankly, of truth seeking. Why do we want to get an education? Why do we want to become more knowledgeable? Why do we want to know things? Well, for instrumental purposes, to get a better job, to get more money, to rise in social standing, to have influence, to be somebody important. What I hadn't even considered until reading the dialogue was that the point of truth seeking, knowledge seeking, is truth itself. That the most fundamental point is truth. That truth is inherently enriching of the human person and desirable just as such, providing us a sufficient, more than merely instrumental reason for acting. Well, I was off to the races, but it made me question and rethink everything, including religion. Some things that came of this rethinking were changes of my views about things. My political views began to change. I had pretty much adopted the standard issue we in those days called liberal political views of the Democratic Party in those days, and I had been active in politics as a kid. I served twice as governor of the West Virginia Democratic Youth Conference, which was a statewide Democratic youth group. This was consistent with my family's background, being coal miners. My grandfathers were union men, and the unions were really the backbone of the Democratic Party in those days, the industrial unions and the coal mining union and so forth. But when Plato made me put everything on the table for examination, something I hadn't expected, my political views began to change because, frankly, it couldn't hold up under rigorous intellectual scrutiny. By contrast, my religious views strengthened. I became more strongly convinced of the truth of the Christian faith and of the basic Catholic story than I had been previously. Had I not been a Catholic, I think it very likely that I would have converted to Catholicism. My conversion being of the sort that one reads about if you read this, Elizabeth Anscombe's account of her conversion, or Michael Dummett's account of his, or John Finnis's account of his, or Alastair McIntyre's account of his, a kind of intellectual conversion, not so much a kind of revelation or being seized by the power of liturgy or the beauty of the Christian religion and its iconography and so forth. Much more of an intellectual sort of thing. So that's my story. I ended up on a kind of political and religious odyssey, but the religious odyssey more deeply into the faith, which I affirmed more confidently. Politically, really away from where I was toward what counts in the parlance of our day as a more conservative direction.
Well, there is a lot to explore there in greater detail, but perhaps if we start with the religious point, forgive me if this is too invasive of a question, but I was very intrigued there by the point you made about how reading Plato strengthened your faith, and the point you made about how that early numinous experience affected you so profoundly. But have you ever undergone or wrestled with a real crisis of faith, or experienced a moment or event in which your faith in God was shaken to a quite a significant degree?
I thank God that I've been spared that. It's not something I would want to go through. Now, in my college years, after my encounter with that ancient Greek who grabbed me by the lapels and shook me and made me think, one of the things I felt that I had to do, although I wasn't experiencing any spiritual crisis, quite the contrary. Still, I felt that one of the things I had to do was to examine atheism in a serious way, to give it a shot. After all, so many really smart, super well-educated people, and I wanted to be a smart, well-educated person, were unbelievers, were atheists. So I thought it at least has a kind of plausible claim to be true. What leads people to affirm that position? So I began reading in the tradition of what might be called skepticism. Reading Hume Lynn Urban, Professor Urban helped me with this as well. I learned from him who the great skeptics were. So I read Hume, and I read Nietzsche. And I think anybody who wants to get a serious look at atheism, the real thing, not the kind of, I don't know what village atheism that is on offer everywhere these days, and it isn't worth anybody's time, I think. But if you want the real thing, 100 proof atheism, read Nietzsche. So I did, and these are impressive philosophers. These are impressive thinkers, but I wasn't buying it. I mean, it just in the end was not persuasive to me. I felt I could see the problems with the arguments. So I felt that the sort of thing that I was reading in Plato was one of the great religious thinkers of all of history, or in St. Thomas, or in any of the other great theistic philosophers. I felt that they had the superior view, that their sort of open horizon view of things was more plausible, more likely true, more consistent, I think, with everything else we know than the claims being made by the serious religious skeptics like Nietzsche.
Have you ever spent much time or taken much of an interest in religions? Well, perhaps Eastern religions in particular, or more exotic religious traditions and faiths. And well, have you ever, I suppose, indulged much in syncretism over the years to any sort of notable degree?
Well, I'm accused of it all the time, and maybe I'm guilty. Yeah, I'm really interested in all religions. And I formally studied the Theravada Buddhist tradition, and I was blessed to be able to study it with a true master. He was at the time, although in exile, the abbot of the great Theravada Buddhist monastery in Chiang Mai, Thailand. He had the title Jiao Kun, which is a great Buddhist teaching title. He was the Jiao Kun Rajavaramuni. And he's still alive to these days. I still look into what he's doing and what he's writing and so forth. But he was a great teacher, and I learned an enormous amount from him about the Buddhist tradition. And I'll tell you a wonderful story, an experience I had in class with him. He was teaching us the Buddhist doctrine of anatta, the denial of self, the not self. And at the core of that is the importance, in order to become enlightened, of abandoning all passion, abandoning passion. Passion had to be done away with, that the goal was dispassion. And this is sometimes why anatta is referred to as the extinction of the self. So you make the self dissolve by giving up all your passions, identifying the self with passion, which I think is a problematic thing to do for other philosophical reasons. I don't think we should identify ourselves with our passions, but lay that aside. That's my own philosophy. Here I'm telling you about Jiao Kun Rajavaramuni's philosophy, this Buddhist philosophy, very orthodox Theravada Buddhist philosophy from a great teacher. So the students in the class were by and large just enamored with the Jiao Kun, and rightly so, he's a great teacher. But part of it is there was just this trendy, positive attitude toward Eastern religions. Hollywood celebrities were embracing Eastern religions. They still do that kind of thing. They want them on the cheap, though. They want kind of the exoticism, but without the discipline that these religions actually require, and without subscribing to some of the actual strict moral beliefs that they requare. But again, leave that.
You mean you don't look to Richard Gere as a great
There
Buddhist
you
philosopher?
go. So one of the women in the class was taking all this in about the importance of dispassion, and when we moved to the question time, she said, "Now, Chalkun Rajavarmuni, when you say we must eliminate passion, what you mean is that we must eliminate bad passions, envy and hatred and jealousy and greed and but not good passions. So we must have a passion for justice, like Martin Luther King." And the Jalkun just looks at her and says, "Oh no, no passion, no passion." And this left her completely discombobulated, because on the one side she liked this trendy, fashionable embrace of Buddhism, but the Jalkun made her face the fact that this meant giving up some other trendy beliefs that she had. It was a very telling and interesting moment. It's always stuck with me.
Turning back
I'm also, of course, I'm interested in, and I've tried to do my best to promote good relations and harmony and understanding and cooperation among believers across the different traditions of faith. I am a great enthusiast for the document of the Second Vatican Council called Nostra Aetate, the church's teaching on the great religions of the world, one that explicitly calls for those of us who are Catholic to affirm all that is true and holy in the world's religions, implying and then expressly saying that these great religions are not just false, they're just pure falsehood. Of course, to the extent that these religions don't include or deny what the church thinks is true, the church can't think that part is true. It can only think that that's a mistake, it's false. That's just logically necessary. People in those religions have to think that the stuff affirmed by Christianity that they believe is untrue is false. But the church teaches, nevertheless, that there's much in these great traditions of faith that is true and even holy. And that gives us a lot to work with. First of all, to eliminate the kinds of misunderstandings that have led to bad things, including wars, and also then to work together for our shared values, which the document calls on us to do. Now, of course, the document is best known for its affirmation of Judaism and its demand that Christianity purge itself finally of the sin of anti-Semitism, which has so badly damaged the church's witness and caused so many injustices to be committed by Christians against Jews, including churchmen against Jews. So that's what it's best known for. And that's really important. And a lot of my own work has been in Jewish-Christian cooperation. And I really believe in that. But it also then, kind of in second place, stresses the importance of Christians allying with Muslims, which the church itself has done internationally on many shared values, questions having to do with family life and with sanctity of human life and so forth, for example, in international organizations like the United Nations. And here again, I mean, I've worked with great Muslim leaders like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf here in the United States. Hamza and I have worked together against pornography, the terrible plague of pornography and the human trafficking that trade thrives on. And we've worked on other issues as well, religious liberty being one of them. I also have tried to defend the rights of people of all faiths, including as a longstanding member of the board of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, working with Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists of various traditions of Buddhism, the Mahayana as well as the Theravada and other traditions of Buddhism. So I've tried to be a good Catholic, a good Nostra Aetate Catholic who affirms what is true and holy in all the great religions of the world, and who tries to build on the basis of the shared values, genuine cooperation for the sake of justice and the common good.
Well, speaking of trendy beliefs, particularly among people who are discovering and thinking about these things for the first time, I'm curious, do you typically find in teaching classes, particularly to undergraduates, that people typically tend toward relativism in their thinking about ethics, usually out of that standard belief in toleration above all else?
No, the reverse. I find the problem is not relativism, it is fundamentalist moralism. It's not that they think there is no moral truth. It's that they think that the moral truth is obvious. They know it. And they don't have to defend it. Anyone who disagrees with them is a fool or a bigot, and therefore no need for any discussion or debate. You must, if you don't agree, it's your job to fall in line with our groupthink. So it's a kind of militant fundamentalist kind of pseudo religion that is unreasonably absolutist in its moral claims. Now, there was a time when things were different in my own lifetime, when the basic problem was moral relativism. And the first thing a philosophy professor had to do in his freshman philosophy class, his first year philosophy class, was to disabuse his students of moral relativism. They would come in saying, well, there's really no such thing as whether your beliefs are as good as my beliefs and my beliefs are as good as your beliefs. All we have is opinion. We can't really have knowledge. No one can say what's right or wrong. And then the philosophy professor had to run them through a bunch of exercises to show that relativism is actually self-defeating and all that. And it was fun for the professor, and the kids learned things, and that was nice. No more. The problem is now not that they are relativists. It is they are misguided absolutists.
Do you think that relativism just broadly is still a particular threat?
Well, it depends on what you mean by relativism.
Right.
If you mean what Pope Emeritus Benedict meant when he condemned the dictatorship of relativism, I suppose, yes, it's still a problem. But that's a funny kind of relativism. It's a funny use of the term. I think what he's condemning here is the idea that in sexual matters, everything is just a matter of taste. Or when it comes to the sanctity of life, you should be able to decide for yourself whether you think an unborn baby is in fact an unborn baby and can and should be killed, or whether you think a person suffering from dementia, an elderly person who's frail and debilitated, should be given euthanasia. That's a subjective decision, and so it's all relative. Yeah, I mean, if it's that phenomenon that we're examining, it's a really bad phenomenon, and it's not a subjective question whether an unborn baby is a baby or whether an frail elderly person has dignity and sanctity to his life. Yeah, I'll join in condemning that form of relativism. But I don't think that more comprehensively the problem is relativism. As I say, it's a misguided absolutism and an unwillingness to consider the possibility that you might be wrong. One might be wrong in one's moral beliefs. I mean, I want my moral beliefs to be put on the table for examination, and I want people to correct me if I'm wrong. I want people to challenge. Because if I am wrong, I need to know that so I can get into the better position of abandoning my false views and only having true views. I mean, I know, as you know, and as any sane and sober human being knows, that right now, this very minute, I hold, you hold, everyone holds certain views that are false. Right? You know that, I know that. If I ask you, now, are you sure that every single view you happen to hold in your head right now is true? You would say, well, no, I know some things are false. So then I might say, well, but then why don't you change it? And you'll say, because I don't know which ones are false and which ones are true. And that's the right answer. If you knew which ones were false, you'd change them so that you would now have true beliefs in place of the false beliefs. Now, how's that going to happen, though, if I shut down challenges? I refuse to entertain challenges. If I don't allow anybody else to challenge my opinions, if I become dictatorial. It's not going to happen. And that's the problem with so many people today. That's the problem with wokeism, big time. You know, they assume there's no debate here to be had. There's no question that their views are justified by their own lived experience, their self-justifying views, and the very act of challenging those views is an injustice and an offense. That is the road to hell.
You've seen, sorry, go ahead if you want to finish.
Well, I've said what I have to say.
Well, you've seen things change on campuses over time, as you just discussed. Where do you think this new fundamentalism has come from, and this unwillingness to even have conversations? And has it become particularly pronounced just within the last few years, or have you seen the trend becoming increasingly noticeable over a greater period of time?
What I've learned, what I've observed is that, man will have a religion. People are going to have religion. If the old religions go, new religions will fill the vacuum. There won't be the non-religious man, the non-religious person. He doesn't exist. At least he doesn't exist in large numbers. Maybe Albert Camus, I don't know. But even Camus had a sort of religion. So I think there will be a religion. And if it's not a good religion, it's going to be a bad religion. If it's not a religion that encourages reflection, thought, is open to challenges and so forth, it will be a militant, fundamentalist religion. If it's not a religion based on principles of mutual respect and dignity, it will be a religion that seeks domination. Within the great traditions of faith, there have often been struggles between the militant and fundamentalist forces and those who reject those things in favor of I say this approvingly, more tolerant view, more of a willingness to engage in self-critical examination. So we've had that struggle within Christianity, within Islam, within Judaism, and still do to some extent. But now we've got wokeism, and it has turned out to be an extremely militant, fundamentalist faith. It does not brook dissent. It regards dissent as itself blasphemous. Dissent in principle is blasphemous, the equivalent of blasphemous. And it must not be tolerated.
How can we combat wokeism, do you think? Have you been developing perhaps any grand ideas?
What did your dad tell you to do if you're confronted with a bully in the schoolyard? Stand up to him. Don't yield. Wokeism works by intimidation. It's the one and only method it's got for whipping people into line. It's not interested in making arguments. It doesn't think there's any arguments there to be made. Right? So you have to stand up. It's going to take courage. It's going to take people setting an example of courageous defiance, standing up for their rights and the rights of everyone to think for themselves, to challenge these sacred dogmas, to refuse to get in line with the groupthink. That's what it's going to take. There's no shortcut here. There's no formula. There's no magic. It's going to take courage. It always has with militant, fundamentalist, aggressive, repressive, oppressive religions. For example, communism. How was communism in Europe finally destroyed? Courageous witness. It's the Alexander Solzhenitsyns and the Lech Walesas and the Václav Havels and people like that. It's and lots of people you haven't heard of who had the strength of character and conviction to defy the communist authorities in Russia and in the Soviet satellite states. And it's going to take the same thing here.
Now that cancel culture comes as readily for baristas at Starbucks as it does for celebrities and people within academia, I suppose some people would instinctively reply to what you just said by saying, well, I agree with that sentiment, but I just do not want to put my career, my livelihood on the line, potentially for no immediate gain if other people aren't willing to stand with me. Is the only solution for all of us collectively now more than ever to do the right thing and to stand up against this trend?
That's not going to happen because courage is in short supply among human beings, even at the best of times. Which means there are going to have to be some people, probably a relatively small number, at least to begin with, who take the risks, and they're real risks, of standing up to the mob. It's going to take a few people to model the courage that other people need. This is literally to encourage others, to put courage in people who don't have it now. How do I put courage in you? By exemplifying courage myself. Now that encourages you, and then maybe you might be the next person to exemplify the courage. And you, in turn, your witness, your example, might inspire someone else who didn't seem to be a bit courageous, who was cowering in the corner a moment ago, to step forward and speak.
Your friendship with Cornel West is certainly a good example of the benefit of open-mindedness and actual dialogue between antipodes. What are some of the what are some of the ways in which your interactions and discussions with Professor West have perhaps most overtly altered the way in which you think about the world or political and religious questions?
Well, let me say I love Cornel West and I admire him. And he is a dear, dear, dear friend. Now, what do we have in common? Not political views. We're at opposite extremes. I'm a sort of traditionalist conservative, and he's the honorary chairman of Democratic Socialists of America. So we're not on the same page politically. We do share a deep Christian faith. He comes out of the sort of Black Baptist tradition here in the United States. I'm, as you know, Catholic. But there's that shared Christianity and some underlying values there that we share. We are also old-fashioned humanists. We believe in the humanities and in the power of the humanities, in great books and in great thinkers. We love and admire the same great philosophers and literary figures of history, you know, from Plato up to Jane Austen, to Duke Ellington's music, to C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton. Cornell's one of the great Chestertonians in the United States. So we have that in common. We're also both civil libertarians. We're old-fashioned civil libertarians. Neither of us would describe himself as a liberal. But when it comes to freedom of speech, freedom of the press, independence of mind, freedom of religion, we're a pair of old-fashioned liberals. We really believe people should be allowed to disagree with us and state their disagreement and not be punished for it or in any way held back as a result of it. I mean, the stuff liberals used to say they believed in, open dialogue, having all views represented, the critical engagement of ideas, robust discourse. We actually believe that. Neither one of us is a liberal. We both believe it. We're the liberals. You know, we're looking around saying, wait a minute, this is the gospel you guys used to preach. Here we are. There's nobody here. It's just us. So, you know, I've learned a lot from Cornel, and he's been kind enough to say that he's learned from me as well. Because we come from very different backgrounds, and here I'm not simply referring to race, even philosophically. You know, if you look at the thinkers that shaped him, there are people like Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard has the role in his life that Aristotle and Thomas have in mind, our intellectual lives. And no, I'm interested in Kierkegaard. I've read Kierkegaard. He's interested in Aristotle. He's read Aristotle. But the resources that he draws on to do the kind of intellectual work he does are, so how would Aristotle approach this question? How would Kierkegaard approach this question? And there's a lot of robust engagement there. He tends more to see the complexity and difficulty of things requiring a Kierkegaardian leap of faith to get on with life. I tend to be much more of a sort of an Aristotelian systematizer of things, and think, well, we're just gonna, we don't take leaps of faith. We reason things out, we work things out intellectually. I tend to think that the intellect can take us farther than he thinks the intellect can take us. He's a good Kierkegaardian. He's got a much more Protestant view of faith. He tends more in the direction of fideism, not in a kind of strict way, but he's more leans that way. And I certainly am not that. I mean, I'm the opposite of a fideist. So from his point of view, I'm a rationalist. So we learn a lot in our engagement with each other.
But before we end with something mercifully lighter, I'd like to go back to a point you raised at the very beginning about education and about how lacking, particularly your pre-college education was. And it's no secret that pre-college education for many people is absolutely shameful in terms of the things that they are not taught. I mean, when I was at school, we barely read more than 2 Shakespeare plays, never mind looking at the intricacies of different periods in history and different philosophical views. What do you think can be done to improve the education system at a very fundamental level? I mean, I've seen the idea being talked about by many conservatives lately that our best hope might be in a broad revival of classical education. And do you think that might be viable?
I do. In fact, I more than think it, I know it. And I know it because I've seen it. I see it happening right now. If you look at Christian classical schools, which have sprung up all over the United States, they are doing a great job. The Jewish day school movement, that's a relatively new thing. And I see students who are coming up out of the Jewish day schools very, very well prepared for college. Some of the Catholic parochial schools have moved back in the direction of classical education, and that's good. Unfortunately, many others have gone in the opposite direction into every trend and every fad, and have just become even worse versions of what we call public schools, the state-run schools over here. So I do think that a classical approach to education is the way forward. The revival of the humanities that is needed at all levels of education, certainly at the university level, also needs to take place at the school level, especially secondary school level, which is why it's very regrettable to see the wokesters going after the inclusion of people like Homer and Shakespeare, for that matter, Hawthorne, the American writer, in public school curricula. There's a movement called Disrupt Texts or something like that, that's trying to drive these dead white male, as they would characterize them, authors out of school curricula. I don't know a polite way to say this. That is insane. And it is denying our young people of all traditions and ethnic backgrounds and everything, of the treasures of civilization that are their patrimony. And people should be ashamed of themselves for even suggesting such a thing. Yet it is becoming respectable, maybe even more than that, trendy, to advocate removing Homer and Shakespeare and Hawthorne and Austen and these other great writers from school curricula. We need more attention to those kinds of texts rather than less. One thing I'd like to see is the further expansion of options for parents. There shouldn't be just a single track that parents have to send their children down. If the parents want private education, we should make private education available to as many parents as possible. That might involve state subsidization or the use of vouchers or things like that. Parents who want religious education, Christian classical schools, Jewish day schools, Catholic parochial schools, whatever, should have that option as a real option, an affordable option. Parents who want to homeschool should have that option. The homeschool movement's been a great thing in the United States over the last 20 or 25 or 30 years. And now with the internet, we have the availability of excellent resources. Now, homeschooling is not for everyone. I mean, not all parents are really capable of doing that. Some just aren't up to it, and others have other pressing, professional and other responsibilities that just preclude the possibility of homeschooling. But a lot of parents over here do homeschool, and there are more who would like to homeschool. And I think we should facilitate that. There's a movement now to discourage it or even ban it. And again, that to me is idiotic. We should be encouraging it for families who see that as the best option for their children and are willing to take up the burden of doing home education with the assistance of all the wonderful resources, curricular and other resources that are available, especially online. So I want to see 1,000 flowers. Well, I know I'm not supposed to quote communist sources, but 1,000 flowers blooming in the educational domain. The more options for parents, the better, as far as I'm concerned. I think government should do what it can to expand the affordability of the different types of education available to families. And I'm all for further encouraging people who work in curriculum development to produce better and better curricular materials, whether it's for homeschooling parents or for schools, whether the schools are public or private, and if private, whether they're religious or otherwise.
To conclude, we've spoken about various thinkers in quite substantial detail, but what are some of your favorite books? What books have had the greatest influence on you, and what should we be reading in the current moment to endure this seemingly never-ending period of quarantine?
Well, I've already mentioned the importance in my own life of reading Plato's Gorgias. In my professional life, sort of at the foundation of it all, my intellectual work is Aristotle, and especially his Nicomachean Ethics. On almost all the great questions on which Plato and Aristotle differ, find myself on Aristotle's side, and yet it was Plato who really was the big difference maker in my life. But if you look at my actual philosophical work, you'd find me pretty clearly in the sort of neo-Aristotelian camp. So Plato's dialogues, I think, are very important to read. Gorgias was very special for me, but I encourage students to read Apology and Euthyphro and Phaedrus, and really as many dialogues as students are willing to read. I've never known what to make of the Republic. That one's a puzzle to me. I still think students should read it. It's his most famous dialogue. It's very long. But that one is still a puzzle to me. I think I pretty much see what he's up to in most of the other dialogues. I have not been able to sort that one out. Aristotle, especially the Ethics. The other work in my field that's significant of Aristotle's is the Politics. But for people who are interested in other sorts of philosophical issues, things like De Anima and so forth are really important and foundational. I really love the medieval thinkers, the Christian ones like Aquinas, but also Jewish thinkers like Maimonides, Islamic thinkers. I think taking courses on medieval philosophy if you have a good teacher at your university, is a great thing to do. So I'd encourage students there. Then, if you look at later thinkers, well, one thing that I think is wonderful to read is the debate between Luther and Erasmus over freedom of the will. Very foundational, really useful it's one that Cornel West and I assign when we teach together frequently, that debate. Other writings of, I'm a Catholic, obviously, but other writings of Luther are interesting. If you want to know how one man managed to upend Western Christianity pretty much all by himself, read The Babylonian Captivity of the Church by Luther. Now it's a bit tough for a Catholic to read because it's really aggressive, but it'll give you, if you didn't understand it, which I didn't before I read Babylonian Captivity. If you want to understand how Luther could succeed in the way he succeeded, well, when you see the power of his rhetoric, you see his skill in polemical argumentation, and I'm not using polemical here pejoratively, but when you see his skill in that form of rhetoric, well, now you can understand how he could do what he did. Descartes' meditations, obviously important in understanding how things began to turn with modernity. Enlightenment thinkers, I'm not a big fan of Locke, but his work's really important. I'm a bigger fan of Montesquieu. Montesquieu's work is important. I'm an enemy of Hobbes, but you've got to read Leviathan if you want to understand the world today. You've got to read Leviathan, really critical. I just published a review in the Jewish Review of Books of the last book of my beloved late friend, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the UK. And in that review, I recount an early morning conversation I had with Rabbi Sachs when he and his wife were staying at my home with my wife and myself. We were very honored to have them stay with us for a few days. And early one morning, we had a conversation precisely about Hobbes and Hobbes's conception of the relationship between the emotional aspect of the self and the rational aspect of the self. Hobbes famously said, "The thoughts are to the sky, to the desires, as scouts and spies, to range abroad and find the way to the thing desired." He's an architect of the view, later made famous by Hume, that our reason is purely instrumental in the practical domain. That when it comes to reasoning about what to do, practical reasoning, our ultimate motivations are passionate. They're emotional. They have to do with feelings, desires. And not with anything we could rationally grasp and seek because of our rational appreciation of the value of the thing. And Jonathan opened the conversation as I was making coffee, bleary-eyed that morning, by quoting that passage and saying, Hobbes was wrong about that. And that's true. Hobbes was dead wrong about that. And yet so much of modern thought is built on that proposition. Erroneous or not, so much is built on that proposition. If we move forward, I'm a Johnsonian. Read Rasselas. Read Boswell's Life of Johnson. I'm also an Austenian. I mean, all of Austen's novels are masterpieces, and her work, obviously, I think every decently educated person has to read. And anyway, they're so much fun. You want to read, you'll read them. If you actually begin reading, you'll read them 10 times before the end of your life, at least. Some people read them more than that. There's great American literature too, especially 19th century American literature. I mentioned Hawthorne earlier, but there are others, as well as writers in English and writers of in translation from other languages. 19th century Mill is very important for me. Most of my early work was in one way or another a critical engagement with Mill. I reject Mill's utilitarianism. I reject Mill's libertarianism. And yet he was an important and is an important thinker for me. Although I'm a critic of the first chapter, the so-called introductory chapter of Mill's On Liberty, I think in his second chapter on freedom of thought and discussion, he gets it just about exactly right. And we have so much to learn from him today with all the groupthink going on and the illiberalism and the shutting down of people's speech. Mill tells us exactly why that's a bad idea in chapter 2 of On Liberty. The other great thinker of the 19th century that's important for me is Newman. Newman's work in all the different areas in which he was a master. His autobiography, obviously, is a masterpiece, but his work on education, which I was surprised when Cornel West and I taught the idea of a university in one of our seminars. I was really surprised that students found it so engaging. We were worried that the Baroque language and so forth would alienate students, that they wouldn't resonate with Newman. Well, they did, it turns out. He was one of the most popular writers, if not the most popular writer in that administration of the seminar. So there's his work in education. There's his work in epistemology and cognitional theory, which is too often neglected and really is worth reading. The Essay in Aid of a Grammar of Assent is a really important one. And for those of us who are Christians, and most importantly for those of us who are Catholic, his work on the development of doctrine is critical. So, Newman has made these enormous contributions in all of these different areas. 20th century thinkers, I've mentioned Chesterton. Chesterton is somebody who's important for both Cornell and for me. C.S. Lewis. Philosophers like Elizabeth Anscombe, Alistair MacIntyre, John Finnis, who was my own supervisor in Oxford, are important. They're important to me, not just as thinkers, but also I've drawn heavily on their insights and their work in my own professional philosophical work. Gosh, I've left out a lot of people. I mean, I think Kant's philosophy is fundamentally flawed, but has such important dimensions to it that need to be read. I'm less enthusiastic about encouraging people to read Hegel, young people to read Hegel, in part because nobody can understand him anyway. In part because I just don't think he's as important a thinker as he's often cracked up to be. But that might be the bias of someone who was completely formed as an analytic philosopher and not in that continental tradition. I'd say the same about somebody like Heidegger. I have some philosopher friends who tell me that Heidegger is a very important thinker, and unless you've wrestled with Heidegger, you're wasting your life. I've tried. I don't get it. I can't see it. But again, that may be the bias of someone who was trained by John Finnis and Joseph Raz in this analytic tradition of philosophy. I think my dear late friend Michael Dummett was another important philosopher for me. Would have expelled someone from the common room of New College for saying the word Heidegger. So we were pretty hardcore analytic philosophers in our tradition. But anyway, those are Guy are some of the writers that I would encourage young people to read. Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail is something I want all my students to read. It's not only kind of historically interesting, given its role in the civil rights movement and King's role in the civil rights movement, just as a work of political thought, and especially as a manifestation of the contemporary relevance of natural law thinking. King's letter from Birmingham jail is really a worthwhile thing to read. It's not that long. It's very intelligible. It's any decently educated freshman won't have any trouble reading it, and kind of a good introduction in a way to political philosophy. So that's another work. I mentioned MacIntyre. His book After Virtue has been so important to so many people. I think it's a very good book, important book. The more important book to me in my own thinking about things was the book that came just after that MacIntyre wrote, called Whose Justice? Which Rationality? I mentioned Anscombe. There are two works in particular that I recommend to young people here and have assigned. One is her magisterial book on intention. Many of the mistakes that people make in ethics have to do with misunderstanding the intentional structure of choices and the importance of the intentional structure of choices. The second is an essay that appeared just about the same time the book was published, called Modern Moral Philosophy. It's a critique of the condition of moral philosophy in the modern period, and it's really powerful and very important, including historically important. It had a huge impact on MacIntyre's thinking, for example. So I'm passing over lots of names that should be mentioned, and books and articles that I should be calling attention to. But that gives you at least a flavor of what I think it would be valuable for young men and women to read.